They say you always remember the moment your life splits in two, the before and the after. And for me, that moment came wrapped in the smell of smoke and gunpowder, with headlights slicing through the rain-soaked dark and the echo of boots against marble that didn't belong in my father's house. I'd been sitting at the piano, pretending the music could drown out the shouting downstairs, pressing each key like a prayer. Like if I just played hard enough, loud enough, the war between my father and the man who ruled half this city would stay outside our gates. But violence has a way of finding you no matter how beautiful the room or how soft the music. And that night it found me. The storm was raging, the house lights flickering, and I remember the sound of the front door slamming open. Not the usual crack of anger from my father, but something heavier, colder, final, followed by voices I didn't recognize, deep and deliberate. The kind of voices that don't rush because they already own the air they breathe. I froze, my fingers hovering above the keys, my heart drumming so violently I thought the sound would give me away. And when I finally turned, he was already standing in the doorway, Luca Romano. Even his name tasted dangerous. He was taller than anyone had a right to be, all black suit and quiet menace, his hair slicked back from a face too handsome for mercy. And in his eyes, God, his eyes, there was no trace of hesitation, just the cold certainty of a man who'd already decided my fate. Behind him, shadows moved. His men, silent, efficient. The way trained wolves move when the alpha doesn't need to growl. And though I wanted to scream, run, fight, something in me went still, as if my body already knew resistance would be useless. "Take her," he said. And it wasn't a shout. Not even raised, just a command, quiet but absolute, like gravity. Two men stepped forward, rough hands gripping my arms, the piano bench scraping back with a screech that sounded almost like protest. And I remember the white-hot burst of fury in my chest as I struggled, kicking, cursing, calling for my father. But he didn't come. He didn't even answer. And that silence hurt worse than anything else. They dragged me through the hall, past portraits of ancestors who'd built their empire with blood and deceit, past the grand staircase where I'd once slid down the banister as a child before I knew what it meant to carry my last name, and out into the night where the rain came down in sheets so thick it felt like the world itself was trying to wash me away. I saw my father only once as they shoved me into the back of a black car, standing at the top of the steps, pale under the porch light, hands clenched at his sides. And for a heartbeat I thought he'd stop them, that he'd shout or shoot or at least pretend I mattered more than a pawn on his chessboard. But all he did was watch, his eyes unreadable, his silence, a betrayal I would never forget. The door slammed shut, and the city swallowed me whole. Inside the car, the air smelled of leather and danger, and across from me sat Luca Romano himself, one elbow resting lazily against the window, his dark gaze tracing my face like he was trying to figure out what kind of creature I was. Enemy, trophy, inconvenience. And the longer he looked, the smaller I felt. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. Something about him pulled at me. Not attraction, not yet. Something stranger, like standing too close to a fire and realizing you don't want to move even though you should. "Your father took something from me," he said after a long silence, his voice low and smooth, the kind that could calm a crowd or start a war. Now I take something from him. I laughed, a brittle, trembling sound that didn't belong to me, because what else could I do? "So I'm payment now?" I spat. "Collateral damage in your little empire game?" He tilted his head, considering, and then leaned forward, the light catching the faint scar at his jaw. "No, princess," he murmured. "You're not damage. You're leverage." Leverage. The word slid into me like a blade. The car drove for hours, the city lights giving way to the kind of darkness that lives outside human reach. And I sat there staring out the window, the reflection of his face beside mine like some cruel mirage I couldn't escape. Every bump of the road felt like a countdown. every mile another step away from the life I knew. Though, truth be told, that life had been a gilded cage long before he came. My father kept me hidden, sheltered from his enemies, from the truth of what he was. But you can't hide from rot when it lives in your own walls. And maybe that's why I didn't cry when the gates of Luca Romano's estate opened, and I saw where he was taking me. It was beautiful, the kind of beauty that terrifies you. An old villa carved into the hillside, its stone walls slick with rain, ivy crawling like veins up the facade, windows glowing faintly golden against the night. Guards lined the driveway, rifles slung over their shoulders, but none of them looked at me, not directly, as if acknowledging me might somehow curse them. When he opened my door, I almost didn't move. My legs were trembling, my breath shallow, but his hand was there, steady, waiting. For one insane moment, I wanted to take it. Not because I trusted him, but because his calm felt like the only solid thing left in a world that had just fallen apart. But I forced myself to look past him, to the mansion, to the gates closing behind us like iron teeth. And I walked without a word. Inside, the air smelled of rain and expensive whiskey, of smoke and secrets. The floor gleamed like spilled ink. Mirrors reflected chandeliers that looked more like cages of light than decoration. And somewhere, faintly, I heard a clock ticking. Slow, patient, like time itself was mocking me. He led me upstairs, not speaking, his stride long and unhurried. And when we reached the room, mine apparently, he paused at the door. "You'll stay here until I decide otherwise," he said simply. "Don't try to run, there's nowhere to go." And then he left. The door clicked shut, the lock turning like a final sentence, and I stood there for a long time, staring at the rain streaking the window, the weight of everything pressing down until it was hard to breathe. I told myself I hated him. I told myself I'd find a way out, that I'd make him regret touching my life. But deep down, beneath the fury and fear, there was something else. Something dangerous, something I didn't want to name yet. Because when I closed my eyes, I could still see the way he'd looked at me in that car. Like I wasn't just leverage, like I was already his. And maybe that's what terrified me most. The first night in his house didn't feel real. More like the aftertaste of a nightmare, the kind that clings to your skin long after you've woken, when you can still feel the weight of invisible hands on your throat, reminding you that even dreams can bruise. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. The rain hadn't stopped, and every drop against the window sounded like the ticking of a bomb, like time counting down to something I couldn't yet see. The room was too beautiful to belong to a prison. Silk sheets, heavy curtains, a chandelier that threw trembling light across the walls. But I knew better than to be fooled by luxury. I'd grown up surrounded by it, and if my father's mansion had taught me anything, it was that beauty often hides the rot beneath. When dawn finally broke, gray and cold, I got up and pressed my palm against the window. The glass was icy. Beyond the manicured gardens, mist clung to the hills like smoke. And down by the gates, 2 men stood with rifles, their silhouettes still as statues. I wondered if they'd shoot me if I ran. I wondered if they'd hesitate. Probably not. The door opened just as I turned, and I jumped, the sound too sharp in the quiet. But it wasn't him. It was a woman, middle-aged, dressed in black, her hair pulled tight, her expression unreadable. She carried a tray. "Breakfast," she said, setting it down without meeting my eyes. I wanted to ask her 1,000 things. Where am I? How long will I be here? Does he do this often? But something in her posture warned me against it. She wasn't cruel, just afraid. And fear is contagious. When she left, the lock clicked again, sealing the silence back around me like a second skin. I ate nothing. Hunger felt irrelevant when your freedom had been stolen. Hours passed, maybe more, before I heard footsteps again. Slow, deliberate. like a rhythm you could almost mistake for music if you weren't listening too closely. And then the handle turned. Not the careful movement of a servant, but the confident twist of someone who never asked permission. Luca Romano stepped inside as if the room belonged to him. And maybe it did. He wasn't wearing a suit this time, just a black shirt, sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms dusted with faint scars that looked too deliberate to be accidents. There was something disarming about seeing him without armor, and I hated that I noticed. He stopped near the window, his gaze flicking to the untouched tray before finding mine. "You didn't eat." I crossed my arms, trying to steady my voice. "Would you?" A flicker of something, amusement maybe, curved the corner of his mouth, but it never reached his eyes. "You'll need your strength," he said quietly. "This house has a way of testing people." "Is that a threat?" "No," he said, and for a second his tone softened, almost too soft. "It's a truth." He walked closer then, slow enough to give me time to move if I wanted, but my feet stayed planted, rooted by something I couldn't name. The scent of his cologne, smoke, cedar, and something darker underneath filled the space between us until breathing felt like a confession. "Why me?" I asked finally, forcing the words out. "You could have taken anything from him. Money, property. Why me?" He studied me for a long moment before answering, his eyes unreadable. "Because you're the one thing he pretends he loves. I wanted him to feel what it's like to lose control." My throat tightened. "And you think holding me here gives you control?" He smiled then, slow and dangerous. "No, sweetheart. It gives me leverage. Control is something else entirely." I wanted to slap him. I wanted to scream. Instead, I did the one thing I didn't expect from myself. I laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that filled the room like shattered glass. "You sound just like him," I said. "You think power means breaking things to prove you can." That made him pause. The smile faded. His gaze sharpened, not with anger, but with something heavier, something that felt almost like recognition. "Maybe," he said softly, "or maybe I just learned from the best." And for a fleeting second, too fast, too fragile, I saw the man behind the mask, the one who wasn't a monster but a product of the same corruption that had raised me, the same rot that had built empires from other people's bones. It terrified me how human he looked in that moment. He turned toward the door, his hand on the frame, and without looking back said, "You're safe here, as long as you don't give me a reason to change that." Safe. The word echoed in my mind long after he left. Safe didn't belong in a place like this. Days blurred after that, morning sunlight slipping through curtains I couldn't open, footsteps in the hall I couldn't follow, silence pressing down until even my thoughts began to whisper instead of speak. The woman in black, I learned her name was Rosa, came and went without words. Each time she set down food, her eyes flicked toward the door, as if afraid of what might happen if I spoke. It wasn't until the fourth night that something changed. I couldn't sleep again, and I found myself pacing the room, every creak of the floor reminding me I wasn't supposed to exist outside his control. I don't know what possessed me. Defiance, boredom, maybe desperation. But I tried the door. To my surprise, it wasn't locked. For a long minute, I just stood there, heart hammering, waiting for someone to shout, for footsteps to rush, but nothing came. The hallway beyond was dim, empty. I stepped out, barefoot, the air cooler, carrying the faint scent of rain-soaked stone. I didn't have a plan, just a pulse and a reckless urge to feel human again. The house stretched endlessly, corridors curving like secrets, shadows clinging to corners. Somewhere below, I heard faint music. A piano, notes drifting up like smoke. Curiosity pulled me toward it. The closer I got, the clearer it became. Soft, mournful, Not practiced, but raw, like someone playing to forget rather than impress. When I reached the doorway, I froze. It was him. Luca sat at the piano, sleeves rolled, head bowed, fingers moving with unexpected grace over the keys. In the dim light, he didn't look like a captor. He looked lost, haunted. The music seemed to come from somewhere deep, from a wound he'd learned to live with but never heal. I should have turned back. I should have. But the sound, it broke something in me. I stepped closer, one slow breath at a time, until the floor creaked beneath me. His hands stilled instantly, but he didn't look up. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly. "Neither should you," I whispered. That made him glance up, and the look he gave me wasn't anger. It was something else entirely, something dangerous because it wasn't supposed to exist between enemies. For a moment, neither of us moved, the air between us charged and fragile, and then he stood. "You think I'm a monster," he said, taking a step toward me. "You think I don't feel, but you have no idea what your father did, what he took from me." "Then tell me," I breathed, and I meant it, because I needed to understand, not to forgive, but to survive. He stared at me for a long time, his jaw tight, the war in his eyes tearing at something in me I didn't want to name. And finally, he said in a voice low enough to break the air, "I will, but not tonight." And before I could speak, before I could ask what he meant, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the echo of a song that still hung in the air. A song that didn't belong to an enemy, but to a man who'd already started to haunt me. I didn't see him the next morning, though part of me, the part I refused to name, expected to. The memory of that night, of him at the piano, had lodged itself in my thoughts like a splinter I couldn't pull free, and every time I closed my eyes I heard those notes again, soft and raw, as if they'd been carved from regret itself. The house felt different after that. Not louder or quieter, just more awake, as if it had noticed me for the first time. Servants moved through the halls with the practiced invisibility of people who had learned not to draw attention. The guards outside the windows were ghosts in suits. But beneath it all, I could feel him. Not his footsteps or his voice, but his presence. A shadow that seemed to stretch across every corridor. I started walking the halls in the afternoons, half expecting someone to stop me, half hoping they would. No one did. Rosa still brought food and silence, but I began to sense the smallest flicker of something in her eyes. Sympathy, maybe, or pity, though she never spoke it aloud. Once I asked how long she'd worked here. She just said, "Long enough," and left before I could say more. There was a library on the second floor, doors carved with vines and wolves, the kind of place built by a man who thought knowledge could make him immortal. It became my refuge, rows of leather-bound volumes, dust swirling in the beams of afternoon light, the air smelling faintly of old paper and smoke. I lost hours there, tracing spines I couldn't read, finding pieces of lives that had nothing to do with mine. Maybe that's why I didn't hear him come in. "You read," he said, and I spun, heart jolting, because I hadn't realized how close he was until I saw his reflection in the glass. Luca stood by the door, unarmed but dangerous in the way quiet storms are. His expression was unreadable, eyes flicking from the book in my hand to my face. I wanted to tell him not to sneak up on people, but something about the way he watched me made the words die in my throat. "Does that surprise you?" I managed finally. "Not surprise," he said. "Interest." He walked closer, slow, measured, the soft thud of his shoes against the rug too deliberate to be accidental. "Most people panic when they're trapped," he went on. "You look for meaning." I held his gaze, even though every instinct screamed not to. "Maybe that's because I've lived trapped my whole life," I said, and the words came out sharper than I intended. That made him stop. His eyes darkened, not in anger, but with something heavier. Memory, maybe. He studied me as if I'd just spoken a language he used to understand but hadn't heard in years. Your father kept you hidden, he said quietly. I know. The air between us shifted, something tight and brittle snapping. You don't know anything, I said, though my voice betrayed me. Too soft, too defensive. I know he built walls, Luca replied, his tone even. And I know what kind of man needs walls that high. I wanted to hate him for saying it. But the truth was, I'd thought the same countless times. That my father's empire was built on secrets thick enough to drown in, and that maybe I was just another secret he'd rather forget. I turned back to the shelves, pretending to read, even as I felt Luca's gaze still on me. He moved closer, not enough to touch, but close enough that I could feel the quiet weight of him beside me. You think I'm like him, he said finally. I didn't answer. Maybe I am, he added, but I didn't bring you here to hurt you. I turned then, meeting his eyes fully for the first time in daylight. You kidnapped me, I said. That's a kind of hurt. A muscle in his jaw twitched. Yes, he said simply, but I could have done worse. It wasn't a threat. It was an admission, and somehow that made it more unsettling. For a long moment we just looked at each other, and I hated that my pulse didn't seem to know which emotion to follow. Fear or fascination. There was a gravity to him, a pull that felt both dangerous and inevitable, like standing too close to the sea during a storm and realizing you don't want to step back. When he finally left, the room felt colder, emptier, as though he'd taken something with him, or maybe left something behind. That night I couldn't stop thinking about his eyes, the way they'd softened when he said he didn't want to hurt me. I tried to convince myself it was manipulation, a tactic, another weapon in his arsenal. But the image of him at the piano, head bowed, the music trembling under his fingers, that didn't belong to a man who only knew cruelty. Days slipped into a rhythm that wasn't freedom, but wasn't quite captivity either. He allowed me to walk the gardens, accompanied by 2 guards who kept their distance. I'd catch glimpses of him sometimes, talking to his men, standing near the fountain with a phone pressed to his ear, or looking out across the valley as though the horizon might answer whatever haunted him. Each time he seemed both close and impossibly far away. One afternoon, I found myself in the greenhouse, a glass cathedral of overgrown roses and ivy, wild and fragrant and alive. It was beautiful in a way that felt unguarded, untamed, and I couldn't help but smile. You found my mother's garden, his voice came from behind me, low and calm. I turned, startled again. Maybe I'd never get used to how silently he moved. She built this place before I was born, he said, stepping forward. She said even monsters need something to keep alive. His gaze lingered on a dying rose near the edge of the path, petals darkened with rot. She used to say the most dangerous thing a man could lose was his softness, he added, almost to himself. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't. He looked at me then, really looked, and for a heartbeat the mask slipped. I saw grief there and loneliness so old it had become part of him. You think I'm cruel, he said, but cruelty was learned, not born. Then unlearn it, I said quietly, surprising even myself. Something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or amusement, or the ghost of something gentler. And then he stepped closer, close enough that the scent of rain and smoke filled my lungs again. Careful, princess, he murmured. You don't know what you're asking for. Maybe I do, I said, meeting his gaze without flinching. For a long, fragile moment, neither of us moved. The world outside the glass walls blurred into gray, rain beginning to fall again, soft and steady, each drop echoing like a heartbeat. And then slowly, Luca stepped back. "Dinner's at 8, he said, his voice steady again, all warmth gone. "You'll join me." He left before I could answer, his reflection vanishing in the glass, but the sound of his words lingered like a promise, or a warning. And as I stood there alone among the roses, the first spark of something dangerous flared inside me. Not love, not yet, but curiosity. Sharp and alive. Because maybe the real prison wasn't the one he'd built around me. Maybe it was the one I was starting to build around him. I don't know what I expected when he said, "Dinner at 8. Maybe a performance? Guards at the walls, crystal and intimidation served side by side. But when the clock struck, the world inside the Romano estate felt almost hushed. The kind of hush that follows lightning before the thunder remembers itself. Rosa appeared at my door as if she had been waiting in the hallway for hours. She didn't speak, only handed me a simple black dress. It wasn't silk or sequins, just fabric that fell quiet against my skin, soft enough to remind me I still had one. I wanted to ask her why me, why now, but her eyes flicked toward the corridor, and the unspoken answer was clear. Questions had consequences. The dining room looked like something carved from an old cathedral. Long table, candles instead of bulbs, shadows licking at the edges of gold-framed paintings. Luca was already there, standing beside a decanter, pouring dark wine into 2 glasses. He glanced up as I entered, his expression unreadable, but the faintest curve touched his mouth. Not quite a smile, not quite mockery. "You came," he said. "As if I had a choice," I replied, though even I could hear how hollow it sounded. He gestured to the chair across from his. "Everyone has a choice," he said. "They just don't always like what it costs." We ate mostly in silence at first. The food was rich. The kind of meal meant to impress diplomats, not prisoners, but each bite turned to dust in my mouth. He moved with slow precision, knife, fork, sip of wine, as if control itself was a ritual he performed to stay alive. Finally, I said, "You promised to tell me what my father did." His hand paused, knife hovering above the plate, then lowered with deliberate care. "Promised?" he echoed, a low sound that might have been amusement. "I said I would, not when. But maybe tonight is as good a time as any." The candlelight caught the scar along his jaw as he leaned back, and his eyes, dark, endless, found mine. "Your father and I built something together once," he began, "before the newspapers called us enemies. We were partners. Friends, if men like us can use that word." The word friends hung in the air like a ghost. "He had vision," Luca continued, "and greed. We ran shipments, laundered money through legitimate fronts. Then came the deal, the one that could have made us both untouchable. But power," he said softly, "has a way of asking for blood." His gaze drifted past me, to a point only memory could see. "He sold my brother," he said. "Gave him up to a rival syndicate to buy himself another year of peace. My brother trusted him, walked straight into a trap because of him. They left him in the river." The room seemed to tilt. I stared at him, at the calm with which he spoke of death, of betrayal, and something cold settled beneath my ribs. "My father," I began, but the words failed. "Your father," he said, voice quiet, never blinked. I felt sick, and yet some traitorous part of me believed him. My father had always been 2 men, the one who kissed my forehead goodnight, and the one who disappeared for days when the city trembled. Luca refilled our glasses but didn't drink. "You wanted truth," he said. "There it is." For a long time I could only listen to the tick of the antique clock. The fire snapped softly behind him, throwing light that caught the edges of his hair, the veins at his temple. He didn't look like a monster now, just a man who'd run out of ways to bury his ghosts. "What happens now?" I asked. He looked up sharply. "Now you understand why I couldn't leave you where you were. He would have used you again. Against me, against anyone. At least here you're not a weapon. Here I'm a hostage." His jaw tightened. "Call it what you need to." Something inside me cracked then. Not loudly, not visibly, just a thin seam opening between fear and understanding. "You think keeping me here saves me," I said. "But you're just building another wall, another version of him." That made him stand. He paced once, twice, like a lion circling an invisible cage. When he stopped, his voice had lost its edge. "Maybe," he said, "but I'm trying to learn how not to be him." The honesty in it stunned me more than any threat could have. It was the first time he'd admitted weakness. He walked to the window, rain sliding down the glass in silver streaks, and said almost to himself, "Do you know what silence sounds like after a man's last breath?" "No," I whispered. "It sounds like memory. It doesn't fade. It follows." For a heartbeat, the only thing between us was that sound. The rain, the clock, the weight of things we couldn't change. "Luca," I said before I could stop myself, his name strange and human on my tongue. He turned, and the look in his eyes made the air feel thin. Not fury, not victory, just exhaustion. "I don't need your forgiveness," he said. "But I wanted you to know who your father really is. If you ever leave this place, don't go back to him." "If," I repeated. "You will one day, when I've finished what needs finishing." I wanted to ask what that meant, but something in his tone warned me not to. The dinner ended not with dessert, but with silence, the kind that means more than words could. As I rose to leave, he spoke again, softer. "The world you came from, it's collapsing? When it does, don't look for the hero. There isn't one." I turned in the doorway, my voice shaking. "Then what are you?" He hesitated. The smallest pause, but it felt like forever. "The last mistake he'll ever make," he said. And I left him there, standing among the shadows and candlelight, a man made of vengeance and memory, while outside the storm gathered like an omen against the windows. Back in my room, I pressed my forehead to the glass, watching lightning flash across the valley. I should have felt hatred, or fear, or at least clarity. Instead, what filled me was something far worse: understanding. Because for the first time, I realized that every person in this story, including me, was just trying to survive the wreckage our fathers had built. And somewhere deep down, against every warning, I knew this dinner wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of whatever would destroy us next. The rain didn't stop for 3 days. It came down in long, silken sheets that blurred the world beyond the estate's iron gates, turning the city lights in the distance into ghosts trembling behind the downpour. I spent most of those days by the window, watching, listening, trying to tell whether the thunder outside or the silence inside was louder. It's strange how quickly captivity begins to resemble routine. Breakfast at 8, the quiet scrape of cutlery from the kitchen below, Rosa's soft knock before noon to check if I needed anything I would never dare ask for. Every corner of the mansion whispered secrets. Footsteps that stopped too soon. Locked doors that hummed with electricity behind them, men's voices low and tense when they thought I wasn't near enough to hear. I told myself I didn't care what they were hiding, that all I wanted was out. But the truth is, something inside me had begun to shift since that dinner. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't sympathy either. It was a dangerous curiosity, a need to understand how a man like Luca Romano could carry so much ruin in his eyes and still speak like he believed in redemption, even if it was only for someone else. On the morning of the 4th day, I found him in the library, not reading, not plotting, just standing before a wall of old books, his fingers tracing the spines as if he was searching for something he'd once known by heart and lost. The fire beside him threw his face into fragments. Light, shadow, light again. And for a moment I thought about leaving before he noticed me. But he turned, that instinct of his sharper than sound. "You shouldn't wander without a guard," he said. "I didn't know books were considered dangerous," I replied, trying to keep my tone steady even as my pulse stumbled. "They are," he said simply. "At least the ones that tell the truth." He crossed the room, slow, measured, and stopped just close enough for me to see the faint line of exhaustion beneath his eyes. "You've been quiet," he said. "I've been thinking." "About what?" "About what happens when you finish what needs finishing." His jaw flexed. "You think I'll kill him?" "I think you already have." Something flickered through his expression. Not surprise, not denial, but the faintest trace of weariness, as if the question itself carried too much weight to answer aloud. He moved past me to the window, looked out at the rain, and said, "Your father's alive, for now. But his empire isn't. Every man who swore loyalty to him has either vanished or switched sides. He built a kingdom out of fear, and fear never lasts." I swallowed hard. "And you're any different?" He turned back, and for the first time, his voice cracked like glass under pressure. "I'm trying to be." That was when it happened. A sound, low and metallic, from somewhere beyond the hall. He froze, head tilting, eyes narrowing. A second later, 2 guards burst into the room, faces pale beneath the flicker of firelight. "Sir, the perimeter cameras just went offline," one of them said breathlessly. "South gate. Looks cut." Luca didn't hesitate. "Lock the lower floors. Move everyone to defensive positions. Now." The men vanished as quickly as they came, leaving behind the taste of panic in the air. I stood there, rooted, watching him reach for the gun holstered beneath his jacket, his movement so smooth it was almost beautiful in its precision. "What's happening?" I asked. "Someone found us." "Who?" "Does it matter?" He strode toward the door but stopped halfway, looking back at me. "Stay in here. Don't open the door for anyone but me." "Luca—" "Don't argue." His tone was final, cold enough to slice through every protest. Then he was gone, footsteps echoing down the hall like thunder receding into distance. The minutes that followed felt like hours. The house seemed to hold its breath. Every sound amplified, every shadow a heartbeat. Then came the first explosion of gunfire, distant, muffled through the walls, but unmistakable. I pressed my palms against my ears, heart pounding, every instinct screaming to hide, to run, to do something. But something stronger kept me still. That voice in my head, the one that remembered the way his eyes had looked before he left. Not afraid, not cruel, just resigned. When the shots grew louder, closer, I couldn't stand it anymore. I opened the door. The corridor beyond was dim, lit only by the tremble of emergency lights, red and blinking like a dying heartbeat. Smoke coiled faintly through the air. I could hear shouting, men's voices, orders, chaos. I moved, barefoot and terrified, down the hallway, past shattered glass and the smell of gunpowder. The library's grand door was open now, the fire still burning, but the room was empty. Something inside me, instinct, maybe madness, pulled me toward the sound of the fight. Down the stairs, through the hall, and there he was. Luca, crouched behind a marble column, gun in hand, firing with cold precision toward the courtyard beyond. The rain had turned the marble floor slick with mud and blood, the air thick with smoke. I saw the flash of return fire, saw one of his men fall, and before I could stop myself, I shouted his name. He turned, eyes widening when he saw me. "Get back!" he barked. But it was too late. One of the intruders, masked, moving fast, had broken through the front door, weapon raised. Time slowed to a pulse. I saw Luca pivot, saw the explosion of light as he fired, saw the body drop, and then he was in front of me, grabbing my wrist, dragging me behind cover. "Are you out of your mind?" he hissed, pressing me against the wall as another shot cracked the air. "I heard the gunfire. You don't walk into a war zone because you heard it." He was furious, but his hands trembled where they touched me, his breath ragged, his eyes wild, not with rage, but with something dangerously close to fear. "Stay down," he said again, quieter now, as if words themselves could protect me. The fight lasted maybe 10 minutes, maybe forever. When it finally ended, silence fell heavy and absolute, broken only by the hiss of rain and the faint, awful sound of someone dying on the marble. Luca stood slowly, gun still in hand, chest rising and falling with exhausted control. I looked at him, the blood on his sleeve, the shadowed hollows beneath his eyes, and for the first time I realized something that terrified me more than any gunfire could. I didn't want him to die. And worse, I wasn't sure I could ever go back to the world that wanted him gone. When he finally turned to me, rainwater dripping from his hair, he said only, "Now you understand why I can't let you leave." And I did understand. But understanding didn't make the fear disappear. It only made it burn hotter, sharper, closer to my heart. Because love, I was beginning to learn, doesn't come softly. It arrives like gunfire in the rain. The world after the gunfire didn't feel real. It felt borrowed, as though time itself had paused just long enough to decide who was meant to keep breathing and who wasn't. The rain outside had softened into mist, wrapping the estate in something close to silence. But it wasn't peace. It was aftermath. The kind that hums beneath your skin, that fills your lungs with ghosts you can't name. The marble floors were slick with rain and blood, the smell of gunpowder clinging to everything. And Luca stood at the center of it all like the storm's final survivor. His shirt was half soaked, torn at the shoulder, the dark stain spreading down his arm. But he didn't seem to notice. He was scanning the room, assessing, calculating, breathing like a man who couldn't afford to stop. When his eyes finally met mine, something unspoken passed between us. Not safety, not comfort, but a fragile understanding that neither of us could go back to what existed before tonight. "They found us," he said quietly, his voice low enough that the words barely reached me. "We have to move." "Move where?" "Anywhere they can't." He turned to one of his remaining men, a tall, scarred veteran whose eyes were sharp even under exhaustion. "Clean this up. Burn what you have to. No traces." The man nodded. Luca reached for my wrist, not roughly, not possessively, just firmly, and led me toward the back corridor. My body followed before my mind could catch up, my pulse hammering so loudly I barely heard the creak of the floorboards beneath us. We passed through rooms I hadn't seen before, narrow hallways with brick walls, a stairway that seemed to spiral endlessly downward until the air grew colder, heavier, and the scent of damp earth filled my lungs. A hidden door waited at the bottom, steel and ancient, disguised behind a wall of crates. Luca entered a code on a small panel I hadn't noticed, and the door slid open with a hiss that sounded like the mansion exhaling its final breath. "What is this place?" I whispered. "An exit no one's supposed to know exists," he said. "Not even most of my men." We stepped into darkness that felt almost alive. A tunnel, narrow and uneven, the sound of dripping water echoing somewhere ahead. He took a flashlight from his belt, its beam slicing through the black, catching glimpses of stone, mud, and something that looked like history, buried too deep to name. "Where does it lead?" "Outside the city. To a safe house." Safe house. The word sounded ironic coming from him, as if safety was a concept that could still apply to either of us. We walked for what felt like forever. the tunnel twisting beneath the world like a secret spine. The only sounds were our footsteps and the rhythm of our breaths, both too loud, too fragile. Every few minutes he'd glance back, checking if I was keeping up, his expression unreadable but his pace adjusting slightly each time. When we finally emerged, the night hit me like a shock. Cold air, the scent of wet pine and diesel, and above us a sky so wide it looked torn open. The tunnel's exit was hidden behind a broken barn on high, the outskirts of nowhere, the kind of place where the world forgets to look. A black SUV was waiting nearby, its engine already running. Luca opened the passenger door for me, his movements brisk but careful, as though the exhaustion hadn't touched him yet. When he slid into the driver's seat and the vehicle roared to life, I caught the faint tremor in his hand as it gripped the steering wheel. He drove without speaking. The road wound through endless stretches of wet asphalt and flickering streetlights, and with each passing mile the city faded into memory. I wanted to ask where we were going, why he trusted no one else, what he was running from. But every time I opened my mouth, something about his silence stopped me. After an hour, the forest thinned, and a cabin appeared ahead. Small, dark, isolated against the hillside. The headlights swept across its wooden frame, revealing bullet holes patched with metal, and a single lantern burning by the porch. "This is it?" I asked softly. "For now." The rain had begun again, thin and whispering, by the time we stepped inside. The air smelled of cedar and smoke. The cabin was sparse. A single couch, a table, 2 rooms, a fireplace half full of ash. He checked the windows first, then the locks, his movements methodical, precise, as if repetition itself kept him sane. Only when he seemed satisfied that we were truly alone did he finally sit, lowering himself onto the couch like a man carrying the weight of the dead. "Let me see your arm," I said quietly. "It's nothing. It's bleeding." He didn't move, didn't protest when I knelt beside him. I tore a strip from a linen towel, pressing it gently to his shoulder. The wound wasn't deep, but it was enough to sting. And when his breath hitched, something in my chest ached unexpectedly. "You shouldn't be here," he murmured. "You keep saying that," I replied, my voice softer now. "And yet you keep bringing me with you." His eyes lifted, dark, tired, almost human. "You think I want this?" "I think you don't know what you want anymore." The silence that followed was thick, but not empty. It felt like the space between 2 truths that hadn't yet collided. Finally, he said, "You remind me of the part of myself I keep trying to kill." I froze, unsure if he meant it as a confession or a curse. "What part is that?" "The one that still believes in mercy." I should have looked away then, should have let the words slide past like smoke, but I didn't. I held his gaze, saw the faint tremor in his jaw, the exhaustion beneath the steel. And for a moment, just a heartbeat, I saw him not as my captor or my father's enemy, but as a man who'd lost everything that made him human and was now, somehow, trying to find it again. The storm outside grew louder, rattling the cabin walls, and when the thunder cracked, he didn't flinch. I did. Instinctively, I reached out, and his hand caught mine, quick, unthinking, warm despite the cold. It wasn't tenderness. It was survival. But it felt like both. We stayed like that, neither speaking. The sound of rain filling the silence that words would have ruined. And then, somewhere in the distance, another sound. Faint, mechanical, impossible to mistake once you've heard it. An engine. Luca was on his feet in an instant, gun drawn, eyes sharp again. He moved to the window, lifting the curtain just enough to see. "Someone followed us," he said, his voice low. The air turned heavy, electric. My throat tightened. "What do we do?" He turned, eyes locking onto mine, and for the first time, there was something almost desperate in them. "We run," he said, "but this time we run together." And as the roar of engines echoed through the trees and headlights cut through the rain, I realized that whatever was coming next, it wasn't just his war anymore. It was ours. We left the cabin before dawn, before the rain could even finish its sentence against the roof. The air outside was a knife of cold, the kind that slices through every layer until you can feel your bones remember what fear is made of. Luca didn't speak as we moved, only pressed a hand against the small of my back to guide me toward the car, his touch firm but not cruel. The kind of touch that said hurry without needing words. The forest was still, too still, the kind of silence that feels rehearsed. He scanned the trees once before we slipped into the SUV. Headlights off, engine purring low. The road ahead was nothing but darkness and mist, a ribbon of uncertainty stretching farther than I could see. He drove fast, too fast, and yet it felt like the world around us moved slower, as if the night itself wanted to keep us trapped inside it. The windshield caught the reflection of his face. Sharp lines, bruised eyes, a mouth set in the kind of silence that could drown a person. Finally, I asked, "Who were they?" He didn't look at me. "Not who you think." "Then who?" "Someone with more money than reason. Someone who wants both your father and me gone." I frowned. "But my father's empire is falling. You said that yourself." He let out a breath that sounded like laughter strangled halfway through. "Empires don't die clean. They rot first. And the ones feeding on the rot are always the hungriest." The world outside blurred into streaks of gray, trees dissolving into mist, and I couldn't tell whether it was the fog or exhaustion that made everything seem softer, almost dreamlike. We drove for hours without stopping, until the sun began to rise behind a wall of clouds, painting the horizon in dull silver. When he finally turned off the main road, it led us into a town so small it looked forgotten by time. A few shuttered stores, a diner with a flickering sign, and a motel whose paint peeled in long, sad strips. He parked behind it, out of sight, and turned to me. "We can't use real names here. No phones, no cards. Cash only." "What do you want me to call you then?" He paused, almost smiling. "Nothing. People don't ask questions when you give them silence." "And me?" He studied me for a long moment, his gaze softening just enough to make my chest tighten. "You look like a Clara," he said finally. "Quiet, polite, the kind of name that doesn't get remembered." "Clara," I repeated. "Sounds like someone who knows how to disappear." "Exactly." Inside, the motel smelled of dust and old air, but it was warm. The woman behind the counter didn't ask for identification, didn't look up long enough to care who we were. Luca handed her a few bills, his voice low and measured, and a minute later we were standing in a narrow room with a single bed, a rusted heater, and curtains that looked older than the building itself. He closed the door behind us, leaned against it for a moment, as though the weight of the night had finally found him. When he spoke, it was more to the air than to me. "They'll search the cabin. By tonight, they'll know we're gone. And then? And then they'll start looking for where we ran." I sat on the edge of the bed, my mind struggling to catch up with everything that had happened. The gunfire, the tunnel, the flight into nowhere. It felt like my life had been stripped down to movement and breath, as if standing still might mean vanishing altogether. He crouched to check the bag he'd brought, counting magazines of ammunition, wiping his hands against a cloth that came away stained with dried blood. It was only then, in the gray light filtering through the blinds, that I saw how human he looked. Tired, older than his years, the kind of tired that sleep wouldn't fix. "You should rest," he said. "So should you." "I don't sleep when I'm being hunted." There was no bravado in his voice, only truth. Hours passed. The day outside never fully brightened, trapped somewhere between dusk and dawn. He sat by the window most of the time, watching the street, his gun resting on the table beside him, while I lay on the bed pretending to sleep. But even with my eyes closed, I could feel his presence. Heavy, restless, protective in a way that frightened me more than danger ever could. By evening, the storm found us again. The rain came harder this time, thunder shaking the walls, the kind of weather that makes every memory sound louder. I turned on the bed to face him. "Tell me something true," I said. He didn't turn. "Truth is a currency too expensive for nights like this." "Then tell me a lie," I whispered. That made him look at me. Really look, and for a long time he said nothing. Then quietly, "You'll be safe." The lie was beautiful. Lightning flashed across his face, cutting through the room, and for a moment I saw him not as the man who took me. Not as the enemy of my blood, but as someone trying to fight a war he never wanted. "Why do you care what happens to me?" I asked. He leaned back, head against the wall, eyes closed. "Because I know what happens to people who get caught between men like your father and me. They disappear. Not their bodies, but their names, their will, everything that makes them alive." "Then why take me at all?" "Because I thought hurting him would be enough. I thought you were just leverage. And now?" His eyes opened, and something raw flickered there. Regret, maybe, or something even more dangerous. "Now I'm not so sure." The heater rattled softly. The rain whispered against the glass, and between us the silence began to change shape, from something heavy and suffocating into something fragile, like the space before a confession. I wanted to hate him. I wanted to hold on to that hatred because it made things simple. But every time he spoke, every time I caught that glimpse of the man beneath the violence, the lines blurred a little more. When I finally fell asleep, it wasn't from peace, but from exhaustion. I dreamed of rivers, of blood in the water, of a man standing on the shore with his hand outstretched, but never close enough to reach me. I woke to the sound of a knock. Soft, hesitant, wrong. Luca was already on his feet, gun drawn, eyes sharp again. He signaled me to stay quiet, and for the first time I didn't argue. He moved to the door, slow, silent. The predator returned to its shadow. "Who is it?" he called. No answer. The knock came again, louder this time, and then, through the thin walls of that forgotten motel, came a voice I hadn't heard in months, a voice I thought I would never hear again. "Sweetheart," it said. "It's me. It's your father." For a long moment I thought I was dreaming again, that my mind had decided to summon ghosts just to see how much more it could endure. But then the knock came once more. Sharper this time, followed by that voice. Older now, frayed at the edges but unmistakably his. My father. The man whose shadow I'd been running from since the night Luca dragged me out of his world and into this one. Luca didn't move at first. His body was coiled tight, like an animal on the brink of violence, the muzzle of his gun fixed on the door. His eyes flicked to me, a warning, a question, and something else beneath it. Something almost pleading. "Don't speak." But I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The sound of my father's voice cracked through every defense I'd built over the last few weeks, shattering the fragile balance I'd tried so hard to keep. "Luca," I whispered, barely able to hear myself. "It's him. It's really him." "I know," he said, voice low and steady, though I could see the pulse hammering at his throat. "And that's exactly why you're going to stay back." The next knock wasn't a knock at all. It was a command. "Open the door, Luca," my father's voice called, calm and measured. "We need to talk." Something in me broke at that sound, that calm, that control, the tone he'd always used when he thought he still ruled the world. Luca moved closer to the door, keeping his body between me and whatever waited on the other side. You found us faster than I expected, he said, his voice shifting into the tone I'd heard him use with his men. Cold, sharp, dangerous. Don't flatter yourself, my father replied from the hall. You leave a trail wherever you bleed. Luca's mouth tightened. He looked at me again, and for a moment I saw the war inside him. Duty, vengeance, restraint, and maybe something that looked too much like care. Then he said, almost too softly, "Stay behind me." He unlatched the door. The world beyond it felt colder, darker, more real than it should have. My father stood in the hallway, flanked by two men in black coats, both armed, both watching Luca with the kind of tension that precedes violence. But it wasn't them I couldn't look away from. It was him. He looked smaller than I remembered. Thinner, too, his once perfect suit damp from rain, his hair streaked with silver he used to hide. His eyes, though, those were the same. Hard, assessing, the kind that never missed a weakness. "Sweetheart," he said again, softer this time, almost kind. "Come here." Every part of me wanted to move and to run all at once. The room felt too small to hold both of them. The man who made me and the man who broke him. But Luca spoke first. "You shouldn't have come here." My father gave a slow smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "You have something that belongs to me." Luca didn't blink. "She's not a thing." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Then my father laughed, a hollow, humorless sound that made the hairs rise on my neck. "You think you've grown a conscience? That's rich coming from you, Luca. You forget. I know what you did before all this. You and I both know the kind of man you really are." Luca didn't answer, but the air around him changed. Heavier, darker, as if every word he didn't say was a blade sharpening itself in silence. I stepped forward before I could stop myself. "Why are you here?" I asked. My voice came out small, trembling, but it was the only sound that didn't feel rehearsed. My father looked at me then, really looked, and I saw something flicker behind his eyes. Surprise, maybe even guilt, though it was gone as quickly as it came. "I came to take you home," he said. "Home," I repeated, the words sour on my tongue. "You mean the place you turned into a war zone? The place you sold people to save yourself?" He froze, just for a heartbeat. And in that pause, I saw Luca watching him, eyes narrowing like a man confirming what he already knew. "I did what I had to do," my father said quietly. "Everything I built, everything I lost, it was all for you. For your future." "No," I said, the tremor in my voice finally giving way to anger. "It was for your pride." The words hung there, sharp and impossible to take back. Luca's gun never wavered, but I could see his focus split. One part trained on my father's men, the other on me, on the fracture opening between the two of us. My father turned his gaze on Luca again. "You think you've saved her by keeping her here? You've only dragged her deeper into your mess. You're no better than me." "Maybe not," Luca said, voice low, "but I didn't sell my brother for power." My father's expression hardened. He was weak. And that was it. The match struck. Luca moved faster than I thought possible, slamming my father's guard against the wall before the man could draw his weapon. The second raised his gun. But I screamed, the sound sharp and raw. And in that heartbeat of distraction, Luca fired. The man dropped instantly. Smoke filled the room again, the smell of gunpowder, the echo of violence. My father didn't flinch. He just looked at Luca, at the body on the floor, then at me. "This is who you trust now?" he said. "A killer pretending to be your savior?" And I, shaking, breathless, looked between them. My father, the liar who'd built an empire of betrayal, and Luca, the man who'd destroyed it in the name of vengeance. "I don't know who to trust," I said, tears I hadn't felt coming slipping free. because all I've ever been is a piece in someone else's war. For the first time, my father's face softened, almost regretful. Then come with me, he said, and I'll end it. Luca's voice was steel. If she takes one step toward you, you won't live to finish that sentence. Enough, I cried, the sound raw, breaking through both of them. I'm not yours to win or lose, not anymore. The silence that followed was unbearable, the three of us locked in a moment that couldn't hold. Then outside, engines, more of them. The sound of approaching vehicles, headlights cutting through the fog beyond the motel's cracked curtains. Luca looked toward the window, jaw tightening. He didn't come alone. My father didn't deny it. You didn't think I'd come unprepared. The first gunshot shattered the window. Luca grabbed me, dragging me down behind the bed as glass exploded above us. My father's men outside opened fire, the night erupting into chaos, the air thick with smoke and fear and thunder. When Luca turned to me, eyes wild, blood on his face, he shouted over the noise. If we stay, we die. You have to choose, now. And as bullets tore through the walls, as my father reached for his gun, as the world we'd built from lies and fear finally came crashing down, I realized there was no right choice left. Only survival. Smoke hung thick in the air, the kind that clings to the back of your throat and makes every breath feel borrowed. I could still hear the hiss of burning metal outside, the crunch of boots in gravel, the distant wail of engines retreating or advancing. I couldn't tell anymore. All I knew was that the world outside our shattered motel room had turned to chaos, and we were its trembling heartbeat. Luca's hand gripped my wrist, pulling me low against the wall, his breathing rough, his eyes searching for something beyond the panic. A way out, a plan, anything. Stay down, he said, voice gravel rough. He looked different now, no longer composed, no longer the untouchable man of shadows and whispered power. He looked human, desperate. But my father wasn't gone. He'd taken cover behind the dresser, his pistol steady, his eyes locked on the same window where muzzle flashes bloomed like cruel stars. When he shouted to his men, his voice carried authority again, the kind that had built empires and broken them just as easily. And for one awful moment I realized that even in this blood-stained ruin, part of me still recognized that tone, still remembered being the child who obeyed it. Your men will kill us all, Luca shouted, ducking as another shot cracked through the air. My men, my father replied coldly, know who to aim for. I didn't know whether that was a threat or a mercy. Luca fired twice, clean, controlled, and the noise split the air. One of my father's men fell near the doorway, the other ducked out of sight. Glass rained down like a storm of diamonds, slicing through the smoke. I could taste metal, fear, adrenaline. Then silence, sudden and too sharp. My father rose, his eyes flicking toward me. Come with me now, he said again, voice softer but deadlier than before. He'll only get you killed. And maybe it was madness, but I stood. Luca grabbed my arm, his touch fierce. Don't, he said. You walk out there, he'll use you like he used everyone else. Enough, I snapped, yanking free. You both act like I'm property, like I belong to whichever of you speaks loudest. But look around. This is what your war looks like. Neither man answered. They just stared at each other, two predators circling the same wound. Then, from somewhere outside, a voice crackled through a radio. Distorted, frantic. We've got movement! East side! Luca's head snapped toward the sound. They're flanking, he muttered, more to himself than to me. He pushed open the door at the back of the room, revealing a narrow service corridor that smelled of dust and gasoline. Move, he ordered, already reloading. I hesitated. My father's gaze caught mine, heavy with something almost human. Regret, maybe, or calculation. You think he's saving you? He said quietly. Ask him about Palermo. Ask him what he did to earn his seat. The name hit like a strike to the ribs. Palermo. The city whispered in every rumor about my father's rise and Luca's betrayal. What happened in Palermo? I asked, voice shaking. Luca froze, his back to me. For a heartbeat, he didn't breathe. Then he said without turning, "Not now." But the look on my father's face, that small, cruel smile, told me everything. "You killed for me once," my father said to Luca. "Now you'll kill for her." Luca's jaw clenched. "I killed because of you. Don't twist that." Before another word could be spoken, the back door exploded inward, splinters flying like shrapnel, and the corridor filled with shouting and gunfire. Luca shoved me forward, his arm wrapping protectively around me as we ducked through the smoke. My father's men poured in, and the world turned into flashes of light and deafening noise. I remember running, barefoot, trembling, my hands slick with someone's blood, I don't know whose, and Luca pulling me through a side exit that led to the narrow strip of asphalt behind the building. Rain poured in sheets now, heavy and cold. "Cars 2 blocks down," he said, shouting over the storm. We sprinted, the city blurring around us, until a black SUV came into view, engine still running, door half open. Luca pushed me inside first, then slid in after, slamming it shut just as another bullet struck the rear window. The driver, one of Luca's men, stepped on the gas. Tires screamed. Only then did I turn to Luca, my voice barely holding together. "Tell me what he meant. What did you do in Palermo?" He stared straight ahead, rain streaking his face through the cracked windshield light. "It was before I met you," he said quietly. "He made me believe your brother was alive. I went to get him. It was a trap." The words fell like lead. "You killed my brother?" His silence was answer enough. The car swerved as something heavy hit the back bumper, another vehicle in pursuit. I could see headlights cutting through the storm, closer now, too close. Luca grabbed the wheel from the driver. "Hold on," he shouted, spinning us hard into a side street. I felt weightless for a second as the tires lost grip, then slammed against the seat as we hit the road again. Outside, sirens wailed. Not police, not yet. Maybe both sides calling reinforcements. "Where are we going?" I asked. "Somewhere he can't reach," Luca said, "but we're running out of places like that." The car roared into the darkness, and then I saw it, the small black device blinking red under the dashboard. A tracker. My breath caught. "Luca," I said, pointing. "They know exactly where we are." He reached down, ripped it free, and threw it out the window. But it was too late. Headlights flooded the street behind us. 3 cars, maybe 4. "They're closing in," the driver yelled. Luca turned to me, eyes burning with something between fear and resolve. "If they take me, you keep going. Don't look back." "No," I said. "I'm done running from both of you." A flash of light blinded us. One of the pursuing cars rammed the side door. Metal screamed. Luca fired out the window, glass shattering. And through the chaos, over the storm and engines and gunfire, I heard a single voice through a megaphone outside, cold, commanding, impossibly familiar. My father. "Enough running," he shouted. "Luca, bring her out now and I'll let you walk away." Luca's hands tightened on the gun. His voice was low, final. "He's lying." And in that moment, caught between the man who ruined my past and the man who'd rewritten it in blood, I understood that the next choice I made would decide who lived and who didn't. The rain fell harder. The street narrowed. The world seemed to hold its breath. And I whispered, "Stop the car." Luca looked at me in disbelief. "What?" "Stop the car," I repeated. "I'm ending this." The tires screeched, the vehicle spun, headlights whirling across wet concrete. And as it came to a shuddering halt, I saw my father's convoy fan out before us, engines idling, guns glinting under the storm. Luca reached for me, voice breaking. "Don't do this." but I had already opened the door. The rain swallowed me whole. The rain came down harder, turning the cracked pavement into rivers that ran dark with oil and ash, washing over my shoes as I stood between them, between the two men who had rewritten the meaning of my life. The headlights cut through the storm, throwing long, trembling shadows across my father's face and Luca's. It was strange how quiet everything suddenly felt. No gunfire, no shouting, just the endless whisper of rain and the thunder that rolled like a warning somewhere above us. My father's men stood behind him, guns raised but waiting, like hounds trained to hold until he gave the word. Luca, soaked and bleeding, stood behind the open car door, his weapon aimed but his hand shaking, not from fear, but from something heavier. I realized in that moment that both of them were afraid, not of dying, but of losing what little of me they still thought they owned. "I didn't want this," I said, though my voice barely carried. "Not any of it." My father took a step forward. "Then come home. End this now." I almost laughed, a bitter, small sound swallowed by the storm. "Home? You burned our home years ago." He hesitated. His eyes, once so sharp they could cut through lies like paper, flickered with something uncertain. "I did what I had to do," he said again, and I realized those words had been his prayer and his curse all his life. Behind me, Luca spoke, his voice low but steady. "She doesn't belong to you anymore." My father's gaze slid past me, settling on him. "And she belongs to you?" The question hit like a slap. Luca didn't answer, and I saw the guilt in his silence. The truth that he didn't know how to love without destroying, didn't know how to protect without controlling, didn't know how to be anything but what the world had made him. And I, standing in the rain between them, understood that love, if it ever existed between any of us, had been built on violence and fear and secrets buried under too much blood to ever grow clean. "I'm done choosing between men who only know how to take," I said quietly. Both of them froze. "I'm not your weapon," I told my father. "And I'm not your salvation," I said to Luca. Lightning split the sky, white and merciless, illuminating the ruined street around us. The broken glass, the scorched asphalt, the bodies of men who'd followed orders they didn't even believe in. I took another step back, away from both of them, the rain plastering my hair to my face, my hands trembling but steady enough to lift the small pistol I'd taken from Luca's car. "Put the gun down," Luca said, his voice shaking now, his mask of control finally cracking. "I'm not pointing it at you," I whispered. My father's eyes widened as I turned it on him. "You wouldn't," he said, disbelief breaking through the steel of his tone. "You're my daughter." "I know," I said softly. "That's the problem." He took a single step toward me, and I fired. The shot rang out, echoing through the empty street, but I hadn't aimed to kill. The bullet struck the ground inches from his feet, splintering the concrete, stopping him cold. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely breathe. "That was for every lie," I said. "Every time you told me pain was loyalty, that love meant obedience. You taught me how to pull the trigger. Now I'm teaching you what mercy looks like." For the first time in my life, he looked small. He lowered his weapon. The men behind him shifted uncertainly, waiting for orders that never came. "Go," I said. "Leave. Don't look for me again." For a moment, I thought he'd refuse, but something in him broke then. Maybe the realization that the empire he'd built on fear had finally turned to dust. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the waiting cars. His men followed. The convoy disappeared into the storm, leaving silence in its wake. I stood there shaking, until I felt Luca's hand on my shoulder. "You should have killed him," he said softly. "Maybe," I replied, staring at the road where my father had vanished. "But then I'd be no better than either of you." He didn't argue. For once, there was nothing left to say. We stood in the rain until the storm began to break, the thunder rolling farther away, the first hint of dawn bleeding into the sky. The air smelled of smoke and wet asphalt and endings. When I finally turned to Luca, he was looking at me the way someone looks at something they're afraid to lose. "I can't stay," I said, my voice breaking. "Not after this. Not with you. I need to find out who I am when I'm not surviving someone else's war." His expression didn't change, but his eyes, those dark, unreadable eyes, softened in a way I'd never seen before. "You won't make it far without protection," he said. "Then I'll learn." He nodded once, slowly, the faintest ghost of a smile on his lips. "You already have." For a moment, neither of us moved. The rain had slowed to a whisper, and the city around us seemed to hold its breath. Then I turned and walked away. Every step felt like shedding a skin I'd worn too long. The daughter, the captive, the pawn. The weight of all the things I'd lost clung to me. But beneath it, for the first time, there was something else. Freedom. Behind me, I heard the low rumble of an engine starting, then fading into the distance. I didn't look back. When I reached the edge of the street, the dawn finally broke. Pale light spilling over the rooftops, washing the city in a quiet kind of gold. I stopped there for a long time, letting the rain rinse the blood from my hands, the guilt from my skin, until all that remained was the faint ache of survival. And in that fragile silence, I thought of Luca, of the man who'd become both my captor and my mirror, who'd shown me the darkness I carried and dared me to step beyond it. Maybe, somewhere down another road, we would meet again. Not as enemies or victims, but as two souls who'd finally learned how to stop bleeding for love. For now, though, I walked on, into the morning, into the unknown, into a life that finally belonged to me.